Have you ever wondered if aliens may not be coming from outer space, but may in fact originate on our own planet and perhaps have existed here secretly for many years? Well, this is a hypothesis that has recently been published in an academic journal from a Harvard research group, the Human Flourishing program at Harvard University, and this has caught the attention of some of the mainstream media outlets. Welcome to Xpanded Knowledge. I'm Anthony. I'm a history teacher and college professor, and I explore various topics delving into the unknown or lesser traveled realms of human knowledge and thinking about what our reality is. So here, this is a pretty interesting topic that has recently come out. Of course, it's always interesting. Anytime that a academic institution publishes something, it has this power to attract the media and start to talk about it. All right. Now, I read the whole paper, and so in this video, we're going to go through the whole paper, and I'm going to show you what I highlighted, give you some commentary and some insights. I've been studying particularly the UFO and UAP related issues in earnest for basically about the last 3.5 years. And before that, I studied a lot of other historical topics that were certainly outside of what is the accepted realm of human consensus, reality, whatever you want to call it. But it's kind of funny because, as I mentioned in earlier videos, the UFO subject was never really on my radar. I always kind of just assumed that, yeah, there's aliens and, yeah, there's secrets that are kept from us. But I never realized the extent to how strong and massive the body of evidence is for the UAP issue. And, of course, with everything that's going on now, and in the last year and in the last 5 years especially. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing here. In this video, we're going to look at the paper and break it down. All right, it's actually pretty interesting for some different reasons. So hope you stay tuned with us here today. Now, this video, I'm not going to lie, this is going to go longer because the paper was a lengthy one. There's a lot in there, and there's certainly a lot of points that I want to offer some brief commentary on just in my own studies of a lot of these topics that they kind of gloss over in the paper, and then have a little time to just talk about the implications of this, like academics publishing about some of these fringe topics and what this means and where else this could go. So honestly, this video is probably going to run us, I would say, 45 minutes and even up to maybe an hour. This is like a full class here today. I wish I could just fit it into 15 minutes. Trust me, I'm always looking for short YouTube videos that are just concise and condensed with the information that I want. But, it's interesting, like when you're diving into some of this stuff that requires further analysis and discussion, it's just the minutes go by. So I'll do my best to be brief here, but I want to keep that balance between actually analyzing it. Okay, so let's dive into it. Before we get into the paper, it is important before we just dive in and say, oh, Harvard paper, right? Who? What? Okay, so yeah, here we can see it's been out the last few days recently. Aliens. Now, the media harped on aliens may be living among us, disguised as humans. Aliens could be on Earth disguised as humans, right? Aliens may be living among us, right? It's funny because when you read the paper, they briefly mention that as one little aspect of the greater set of hypotheses about this. The Crypto-Terrestrial Hypothesis, as they call it, we'll look at that, is that they could be here disguised as humans. But of course, the media jumps on that. I don't know why, just because it's tantalizing, just because it's maybe fear-based. And anyway, this is authored by 3 professors and a research scientist at Harvard, Tim Lomas. And this is just a little bit about him, the Human Flourishing program. This other author, Brendan Case, who is one of the directors of the Human Flourishing program at Harvard. I actually emailed both of these guys to see if they would do an interview with me. And Brendan responded and said that he's just been swamped with media requests since this paper came out. So I guess that's a good thing. But he couldn't do an interview. And yeah, I mean, the mission of the Human Flourishing program is to promote human flourishing, develop systematic approaches to synthesis of knowledge across disciplines. All right, so these people are from Harvard, and they're publishing this. And then the third author, interestingly, is Michael Masters. And if you're into the UAP subject, you'll have seen him before. And I personally have some reservations about Michael Masters, particularly in his commentary on the Nazca mummies. And we'll get into that in the paper. But nonetheless, he's one of these academics who has been willing to put himself out there and talk about this subject. And the journal that they published this paper in was in the Philosophy and Cosmology journal. And this is an international double-blind peer-reviewed journal. All right, so this paper was peer-reviewed, and I even have a little bit of critique on that because some of the information that they present is, because I've happened to have gone down some deeper rabbit holes on some of the stuff they talk about, it's a little bit, I feel like it's a little bit coming short on academic writing, but anyway. So this is all legitimate in that sense, all right? And that's enough on the background there. So let's get into the paper itself. All right? And forgive me 1 second here. I'm going to actually just handwrite these timestamps to make this a little easier. So we're going to get into the paper now. All right? And we see the title here, The Crypto-Terrestrial Hypothesis, a case for scientific openness to a concealed earthly explanation for unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAP. And this was just recently, right, last week. And, of course, it's interesting. My first highlight here, they put like a disclaimer here saying, the authors, this is a thought piece, speculative thought piece that reflects the author's own interests and ideas and is not associated with the Human Flourishing program at Harvard. And we believe this hypothesis to be in all likelihood false. All right, which I think is like kind of a little bit of a cop-out. At least stand by your decision to publish this hypothesis. Right? I mean, if you really think it's false, I kind of question why would you publish it anyway. And here's kind of a little bit of the abstract. And they're basically saying, how serious the UAP issue has become. And that usually it falls into two categories, right? It's either from outer space or it's a human-made earthly terrestrial explanation. But they say, however, there's a third class of hypothesis that is an unconventional terrestrial explanation outside the prevailing consensus view of the universe, that UAP may reflect activities of intelligent beings concealed in stealth here on Earth, for example, underground, or in its near environments, the moon, or even walking among us, passing as humans. And they say that this deserves genuine consideration in a spirit of epistemic humility and openness. So respect there. And yeah, I mean, I think just on its surface value, this is pretty significant. A Harvard professors publishing a paper in a peer-reviewed academic journal suggesting the possibility of aliens concealing themselves underground or on the moon or even walking among us. So I think that that's pretty significant. They mention Hal Puthoff, and if you're interested, there is a paper, an academic paper by Hal Puthoff in 2022 where he talks about the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis that aliens are living on Earth and maybe even originate from Earth. They also, a couple times in this paper and here in the introduction, cite a philosopher named Bernardo Kastrup. And if you've seen, this guy's been around a little bit. He has spoken on, I believe I've seen him pop up in the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast and also on the Theories of Everything podcast. I actually heard of Bernardo Kastrup many years ago. One of the earlier subjects that I studied was the psychedelic and the entheogenic plant medicines and how they interact with consciousness. And Bernardo Kastrup, I had heard him speak about the nature of consciousness, and quite impressive. Yeah, I definitely recommend checking him out. But apparently he's been more vocal about aliens, and he actually believes that the Crypto-Terrestrial hypothesis is the most reasonable scenario for UAP and NHI. So in his opinion, it's a better explanation than it being extraterrestrial or something. So, and they tell you we're going to break down the Crypto-Terrestrial hypothesis into 5 sections. You've got A, limits to historical and geological knowledge, meaning we don't know that much about our past. 2, traces of lost civilizations. 3, traces of underground civilizations. 4, traditions of magical cryptoterrestrials. And 5, UAP-related activity underground, underwater, and nearby on the moon. All right, and so the first section in the paper, they give the reader who may not be familiar the background of the UAP issue and how it's currently a very serious issue. And actually, this was one of the areas I found interesting about the paper, is they had some interesting citations of some quotes and some information that I had not necessarily come across before. That was kind of nice to come across. And they mentioned Grush, of course, and they say that his claims cannot be dismissed. They talk here about how, like I've tried to highlight, and I'm going to have to just start cutting this out of the videos, because I sometimes assume that people watching these videos have no idea what's going on. And I'm constantly talking to friends and people who are somewhat open-minded to this and are intelligent people, and I try to get them up to speed with all the key bullet points of like why this is such a real issue, and it's not just like flying saucers and wild stories, And they basically, it was funny because like they do that here, and they highlight all of the points that I try to highlight. Grush came out. The Inspector General deemed his claims credible and urgent. And then 6 months later, 16 members of the House Oversight Committee met at a classified briefing with the Inspector General of Intelligence. And everyone came out of there basically saying, based on what we heard, Grush's claims have merit. I think everybody left there thinking, no, and Grush is legit. So props to them for kind of highlighting this for the people who are not up to speed on this. And then, of course, Carl Nell, who is backing him up. And then Tim Gallaudet, who's backing him up, saying, I am totally convinced that we're experiencing a non-human higher intelligence. Of course, Carl Nell also has said the same thing. There's zero doubt that there's non-human intelligence, aka aliens, the official wording for aliens. You can look up both of those guys on your own. Carl Nell, Tim Gallaudet. Don't want to get sidetracked with them here. And then, of course, mentioning the legislation that was passed, the Schumer Amendment. Schumer saying the American public has a right to learn about technologies of unknown origins, non-human intelligence, and unexplainable phenomena. So, yeah, they do a good job of highlighting that all here. And basically saying, again, that non-human intelligence was used in the Schumer Amendment 22 times, so on and so forth. However, and I think that this is actually an interesting point here, the non-human intelligence wording. All right, I don't know what you think about it, but I mean, I'm not crazy about it too. I think it's like kind of not the best wording, like non-human. It's like otherizing it a little bit. I think we could think of a better term. But I had a friend just recently last weekend say to me that he thought that that term was ridiculous, and that was actually why he doesn't believe David Grush, is because he thinks he's covering himself for lying about something. And I tried to kind of explain to him the other context that I think probably throws that into question. But here is a quote, Grush saying that why he wants to call it non-human intelligence. And Grush said, because I don't necessarily want to denote origin. I don't think we have all the data to say they're coming from a certain location. So that's why he wouldn't call it aliens, because alien, the definition alien kind of has a connotation that's coming from another planet or something like that. And then they also talk about Pudov and his paper in 2022 talking, categorizing different things: extra-dimensional, crypto-terrestrial, demonic, jinn, proto-ancient human, time travelers, right? The point here being, like, we really don't have we, the general public, we really don't know what this other intelligence is and what the nature of it is. And that's at the heart of this mystery here. So, and they do mention the time traveling hypothesis. Of course, one of the authors of this paper, Michael P. Masters, has spoken about that. And certainly I think that that's a possibility, but I think that there's this fallacy here of, in the UAP subject, of people trying to say, oh, it's this or it's that. But like, hey, it doesn't need to be one thing, right? Like, it could be a myriad of different things. And the time traveling humans, sure, maybe. I mean, look, we can't know what the nature of our reality really is and what might be possible. So sure, it could be time traveling humans, but I think it's just kind of silly to say like that's exactly what all of it is, you know. And I'm very wary of people that try to say that. Anyway, they mentioned Ross Coulthart, who had said that intelligence sources were telling him that that was part of what was going on, or that's what was going on, time traveling humans. So anyway, they get into the Crypto-Terrestrial Hypothesis now. They're going to present the Crypto-Terrestrial Hypothesis. And, you know, what is that and how are they presenting it? So let's look at it here. They think that this hypothesis, that aliens may originate from Earth or may have come here and are the UAP phenomena, is a result of an earthly non-human intelligence presence operating secretly and outside of the realms of what we're able to be aware of and measure. And they say that their probability of this hypothesis has gone up from 1% to 10%, which is interesting. They talk about different cases in the ocean, and some of these are pretty interesting, I think, to follow up on. Apparently Kevin Newth, who is one of the former NASA scientists as part of the UAP studies, or UAPX group, and he mentioned a 1987 case in New Zealand where basically there was a 150-foot wide USO, that's basically a UFO that can go underwater, that had been spotted going in and out of water, etc., underwater, 800 feet long with a speed of basically 3,000 miles per hour. So that's very interesting. I'd be curious to check that out. And apparently another case I haven't personally heard of, a Russian Navy officer who became a UAP researcher, Vladimir Azaza. And he says 50% of UFO encounters are connected with oceans, 15 more with lakes, so UFOs tend to stick to water. And here they pull out a very interesting little section of the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023 that mentions the USOs, which I thought was a cool bit they pulled out. Quote, damaged or intact ocean service and undersea craft associated with UAP. So they clearly were aware of the presence of this aspect of the phenomenon, and they put it in there. You know, they mentioned Gary Nolan in an interview saying here, you know, he was asked, whatever this is coming from outside our atmosphere or beneath our oceans, and Nolan replies both. And I think, you know, that's where I tend to be inclined to believe the plausibility lies, is that they're coming from all over. They could be, their origins of this consciousness could be many different hypotheses, may be true, may end up being true. And, you know, yes, we see these coming out of the water and not just moving through it. They mentioned the Nimitz, of course. And they also mentioned, that's of course the Tic Tac incident, where they saw some type of thing in the ocean, and they saw the Tic Tac going in and out of the water. So there was some type of oceanic presence there. They mentioned Lou Elizondo. This is one of the more interesting cases that he has publicly spoken about, where there was basically this massive, in the Caribbean, there was this massive circular object about the size of a small island that rose up from the ocean on two separate occasions. And this is interesting, and I've always bookmarked this as looking more into this case. And, you know, you have more of the out there stuff that's less credible but interesting nonetheless say of a researcher like Michael Salla and the people that he works with, who basically say that there are these space arcs around the planet, which are basically like these self-contained spaceships, like massive spaceships that, you know, you can basically continue living on. A species could continue living there, and they're seeded throughout the planet sort of as like a survival kind of mechanism, or who knows, maybe observation bases. And I don't know. I mean, look, if this massive island-like technological device rose out of the water twice and was seen by military, I mean, you got to kind of take some of these ideas more seriously, I think. They mention a lot of these things, actually, that have happened over the last few years. And one thing to note is in this paper, like, by the end of it, if you read the whole thing, you realize that these guys are definitely keeping up with all of the latest UAP UFO information and news. They definitely have looked at all of these different theories that are popular on YouTube. So it's kind of like funny to see them present this in an academic journal, like all these YouTube conspiracy theories and UFO sightings and stories. And on the one hand, it's kind of like it raises an eyebrow, but on the other hand, for me anyway, it's like, hey, this is good. Maybe more academics will start to look into these things and try to scrutinize them from an empirical standpoint and either prove or disprove some of these things, which helps us, I think. You know, we have some of these tantalizing conspiracy theories, and it's, you know, it's kind of limited in what the average person who's just working a 9-to-5 or whatever can really get to the bottom of, you know. And even though there's been some great work done. Now, here's one of the other things, right? I remember seeing this last year. There was this volcano in Mexico, the Popocatépetl, butchered that name, volcano in central Mexico. And there were basically a bunch of these orbs appearing to enter and exit the volcano. And so they open up this idea that, hey, maybe the UAP are going in and out of access points to underground areas, like through volcanoes. And you could check out that video, and I remember seeing that and being like, wow, how is this not going to become like huge media news if it's a real video? Like, these things are just flying out and out of the volcano. It's like wild, you know. And they mention that here, that some UAP observers suggested that this was a smoking gun regarding NHL activity on Earth. And I thought it seemed pretty smoking gun, but, you know, the videos can always, anything can just be suppressed simply by just the mainstream media being coordinated and not covering it, and the government just not choosing to address it. So, you know, in the blue here, it's interesting. They talk about the possibility that volcanoes could be interdimensional portals. They talk and say that, you know, UAP might be drawn to these locations and they might be coming from underground. There are rumors of underwater bases entering and exiting the water. So, you know, these mysteries have led some to contemplate this crypto-terrestrial hypothesis, and I think they have a good point here. We do have some pretty strong evidence that there is this activity in these types of areas. And so what's going on there? And if they're just space visitors passing by and observing, you know, you would think that there wouldn't be this body of evidence of them coming from these areas. And, you know, of course, we have what should be a pretty interesting work, Richard Dolan, with the USO book coming out that he's been working on for a while now, apparently coming out this summer. It'll be interesting to see what's documented there, and a long history of these UFOs shooting up out of the water. And Wendell Stevens, you know, an older researcher from an earlier era, a military guy who was witnessing these and wrote about them. So, yeah, there's a lot of information here in this article. There's really a lot, and I feel like I'm kind of just rushing through it all, which is really not the best way to do this. And we're at about 25 minutes here, so let's keep feeling this thing out. I want to kind of like take our time with this more. So we've dug our teeth into it now here, but there was a lot that popped out here that I hadn't even come across before. You know, they talk about Mike Gallagher, who was a U.S. congressman, and they quote him as saying, an ancient civilization, one of the possibilities is an ancient civilization that's just been hiding there is suddenly showing itself right now. That was on a podcast, the Pat McAfee show, and actually in my book project where I've been collecting all of the different things that U.S. Lawmakers have said about UAP and UFO. Gallagher was one of the guys who was outspoken in the first 2022 UAP hearing, which was the first congressional hearing on UFOs in 50 years, and he grilled the Pentagon representatives about the Malmstrom nuclear missiles UAP incident from the 60s, and he grilled them about the Wilson Davis memo and and that whole incident. And he was, pretty outspoken about it. And that was a very interesting interview. I actually went and listened to what he had to say on that show, and it was pretty enlightening to hear from a guy who seems just, in how he presented on the show as like a regular guy, an intelligent guy who's in the Congress and is just being transparent about what's going on, what they're trying to do, talking about how real the UFO issue is in Congress and what the barriers are there. So that was pretty interesting. All right, they kind of shift here to talking about this possibility of underground origins of the UAP. And they go back to the Shaver mystery. And if you've dove into the UFO subject enough, you'll at some point come across the Shaver mystery. Ray Palmer was a very popular UFO writer of a magazine in the 70s. It actually goes back to the 50s, but Shaver mystery came up in the 70s. And basically this guy Richard Shaver said that he encountered some underground beings that were some type of advanced civilization. Can look into all of that. And, yes, most people ended up coming away saying the Shaver story was a hoax. But Palmer, always maintained that it was legitimate. And there are others who have kind of added on to that and contemplating this ideas. John Keel, who people mention, you hear him mentioned quite a bit. Richard Dolan seems to be fond of John Keel's work, and that's one of the authors I haven't had a chance to dive into. And even though maybe he didn't really say that the Shaver mystery was legit, he was persuaded that crypto-terrestrials were living underground. And Keel apparently wrote an article in 1968 called Secret UFO Bases Across the U.S. All right, so now the underground thing is really interesting. All right, and I'm going to pull up a book title here as a recommendation. Sorry for the underground bases. Where is it? Sorry here. Bear with me for a second. This is the book here. Underground Bases and Tunnels by Richard Sauter. If you have any curiosity in the idea, this kind of theory, hypothesis, conspiracy theory, whatever you want to call it, that there are these secret, deep underground military bases, this is the book to read to start your journey there, in my opinion. Because this guy did all of the hard work and went to all these archives, filed all of these Freedom of Information Act requests. He does this in a relatively scholarly way. He's a PhD, and he doesn't make any kind of claims or, wild. He's just like, hey, I was curious about this question, if this was possible, that there's these underground bases, and he's actually very skeptical about it. But when you read this book, man, it's really eye-opening, and I actually have a whole presentation that I should do soon. I have a whole PowerPoint that I haven't done a video on yet from his research. And you walk away from that basically saying like, okay, yeah, it's basically almost certain that there are these underground bases that are totally secret. And it just makes sense. I mean, if you're going to be the leading military power of the world, of course it makes so sense to have deep underground bases. I mean, there's all this real estate underground. We already have them, right? The ones we know about. And of course, right? But in their, in relation to this paper, they're talking about the extraterrestrials, or rather the crypto-terrestrials, the non-human intelligence, the aliens having these underground bases. And we've seen these claims in the UFO literature for many, many decades. So they're going to return to that later a little bit, the underground aspect. And in this section, they talk about what kind of strengths does the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis have over the extraterrestrial hypothesis? Well, they say it avoids the issues like the difficulties of interstellar travel, right? If they're here, then you don't have to address how did they get here from other planets. I still think we're very limited in our thinking about that, and that's one of the classic go-tos for why it's unlikely, people believe it's unlikely that they're aliens from other planets, because we can't, how could they get here? But, because we're limited in a paradigm of speed of light travel thinking, and I think people are just so stubborn to open up their minds that there are much greater possibilities. And in fact, there were 38 papers published by high-level physicists in the Department of Defense's OSAP program, and under Dr. James Lukatsky from the 2008-2010 U.S. government-funded program, and they published 38 papers trying to address these kind of issues and what could be plausible for how civilizations could travel between the stars. So, if you're actually curious about that, I would go check that out and check out James Lukatsky's books. Anyway, also they're saying it could account for why they've been concerned about nuclear weapons. If they're living on Earth or underground, that would impact them. And yeah, there's some merit there, I think. I don't think obviously it doesn't explain it all, but it's important to have that on the table. Now, here's the other part where they argue why the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis has its strength, and that is in the fact that why do all of these purported aliens that people have been seeing allegedly for all these decades, why are they humanoid? And this is an argument that you see by certain people again and again, like, for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and even I think, if I may be wrong, but I think Michael P. Masters has said this as well. And they basically say, hey, the likelihood of, if there are aliens from other planets in the universe and they came here, the likelihood of them looking like humans or being humanoid is so distantly improbable that, this is an issue that we need to address. Why would they look like that? But I just see no logical merit in that, okay? Because, look, this is a planet here, right, where life developed. And we developed to be, by what we can tell, the most intelligent biological creature on this planet that we know of, right, is humans. And we look like this. And we have 2 arms and 2 legs and eyes and so forth. So why would it be hard to believe that in a universe that just has an unfathomable amount of stars, hundreds of billions of galaxies that are full of hundreds of billions of stars in them, with billions and billions of planets that could be Earth-like, why would we think that it would be a low probability that aliens would be humanoid? So I have serious issues with that line of reasoning. I don't see actually any merit in it. I think it's just like a talking point that people throw out there. But anyway, if you are going to argue that, the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis addresses that, because it says, hey, look, if they're coming from the Earth and they developed here on Earth, then, that would explain why they're humanoid. And Carl Sagan is someone who argued this as far back as 78. And yes, okay, so it was also Michael P. Masters who's argued that. I really have an issue with that. Again, as I just stated, I don't see that being logical at all. I think it's perfectly plausible that there be humanoid-looking creatures from other places in the universe. Like, come on, it's a big universe. And they do mention that, that they could look like Homo sapiens. Of course they could. Moving along here, they talk about, and this is where it started to raise a little bit of an eyebrow for me here, because they start to mention some sources that are, for an academic journal, pretty, fringe. We're talking about a book, The NASA Conspiracies by Nick Redfern, who he's respected in a UFO subject, but I've read a couple of his books, and, his sources are not always that reliable, and it's like he's kind of circulating stories and rumors and legends that may be true, look, and they should be further investigated, and I have nothing against them, but it's interesting that they're kind of citing Redfern in this academic journal. And they talk about how he interviews someone who was apparently associated with the Gemini program, who said that a small band of individuals, I guess of aliens, that represent the last vestiges of an ancient, advanced, isolated civilization responsible for the legends of Atlantis and similar stories, and that they were forced by circumstances to retreat into remote areas for survival. And apparently, there are other testimonies that support this. They mention this thing that came out recently, actually. I remember hearing about this last year. An alleged Dr. Shirley Wright, who apparently was Albert Einstein's assistant in 1947, and apparently she said that the Roswell crash, Einstein was involved with it, and that actually it was surmised that these beings were actually coming from underground, and that they had a connection to the human species. And they talk about former CIA officer John Ramirez, which I think, to be honest, this guy did come on YouTube and do a bunch of interviews. Basically, like, it seemed like maybe like 2018 to like 2022, he was active, and now he doesn't really seem to be active anymore. I've never seen any credentials that he was an officer. And it says he was a CIA agent, but look, like, apparently anybody can come on and say, hey, I was a former CIA agent. I mean, who's really vetting them on YouTube? So I'm skeptical of John Ramirez, although he seems earnest in his interviews and, sharing the information that he says he was given access to. And he said that he saw documentation that they did genetics on the Roswell bodies and that they were very similar to the human genome. All right, so there's all of that. And as we move along here, again, a lot of information here. And they move on here to talking about, like, what supports this crypto-terrestrial hypothesis, right? And they talk about the limits to our historical, geological, and biological knowledge. Well, what do they mean by that? They mean that basically we think that we know so much about our past, but we really don't. And it's in that humility of saying, like, hey, it's possible that there's a whole nother history about us and what happened in the distant past and where we came from and so forth, that we should at least be open to there being the possibility that a non-human intelligence has had some type of interaction, presence, or development on Earth. And, here's a quote from Robert Martin of Chicago's Field Museum saying that we have fossil evidence for only about 5% of all extinct primates. So, what we base our evolutionary theories on is only on 5% of, right, like, what survived. So maybe there could have been other types of beings. And, they say, like, the task facing paleontologists in trying to get an accurate picture of primate evolution is like trying to reconstruct a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle using just 50 pieces. Okay, so in other words, like, yeah, we still don't know a lot, and it's really hard. Even though we know a lot, like, relatively, it's still hard to piece it together. And I think that they're trying to highlight that to be like, hey, look, we should be humble and realize that there may be other possibilities. Then they start to get into some of the ancient sites that have been discovered. They mention Göbekli Tepe. Of course, if you've seen Graham Hancock and his documentary on Netflix and what he speaks about, Göbekli Tepe is a structure that some would say is advanced structure. And it's been dated to 11,000 years old, and this has been generally accepted in the scientific community. So it throws a wrench at our general understanding of human history, which basically says, around 6,000, give or take, years ago is when we started to see the advanced human civilizations developing and flourishing. So if you have something that's twice as old as that, it throws a wrench in that. But it's sort of like something that is controversial. And they cite some other examples here that are interesting, Lake Michigan mastodons, and then that some academics apparently abroad citing Gunung Padang in Java, Indonesia, showing a human megalithic constructions that they date between 25,000 and 14,000 BC. And of course, if that was true, that would throw a huge wrench in everything. But as they say here, pressure from such scholars led the journal to retract the article. So this was fiercely pushed back against for one reason or another. Haven't studied the case myself. Don't know if it's just because of that it's at odds with mainstream archaeology, or if it's that the evidence was weak and wasn't worthy of being in the journal. I don't know, but that's what happened. And they do cite, of course, here this fascinating analogy, which if you haven't heard it before, if we were to look at kind of Earth's history as we know it being 4.5 billion years old, and we were to think about, if that were to be like a 24-hour clock of a day, right? Basically, the entirety of recorded human history would be the last 30 seconds of that 24 hours of Earth's history. And that's always a humbling perspective to think about, is like, man, we've tried to piece together. And you watch those documentaries and that are for the public, and the one last year, the Morgan Freeman one about the development of life, and they speak so confidently, like, this is what they looked like, and this is what happened about 400 million years ago, 3 billion years ago this happened. And I get it, and I'm definitely in favor of us starting to infer and being able to infer what happened in our past. We got to start somewhere, but I think more humility is needed, and we do not know exactly what was going on here. And this brings up some interesting topics. You look at another book recommendation I'm going to give you here is Forbidden Archaeology, and this is by a author named Michael Cremo. And this is a very interesting thread. This book is 1,000 pages long. He made another one that's shorter. Now, I still haven't read this. This is on my to-do list, but I know it's going to be a dense read. But this is a whole nother aspect of this whole mystery of our reality, our history, UAP, whatever it is. And he did this work of looking at these archaeological anomalies that were basically swept under the rug, that were outliers, right? Showing whoa, this is an advanced artifact from millions of years ago, right? Footprints from human footprints from way back, millions, we're talking of years before humans allegedly, Homo sapiens allegedly existed, which is more, in the hundreds of thousands realm in the mainstream accepted narrative. And this book is apparently very well researched, and when he did it, he had some interest from some one or two of the mainstream media outlets, and they interviewed him, and he's explained on recent podcasts that he received such a backlash and threats from different organizations and archaeological institutions and so forth, and he found that to be one of the most interesting parts of his whole experience in writing this book. So we have it. It's there. There are legitimate anomalies that really throw into question our narrative of when and where and how and why humans came to be on the earth. And I think we're a little nearsighted to just accept it and go, oh yeah, we know where we came from. We developed this way through this type of evolution and so forth. There's so much more that we may not know about. right? And as they say here, our understanding of the far more distant past, apart from brute geological facts, is nearly totally blank. And hey, props to, Harvard professors publishing in an academic journal that notion. And I think that this is a move forward in that sense. Moving along here in the blue, we have some type of work here from authors Schmidt and Frank saying that given the poor resolution of our geological record, millions of years in the past, intelligent or even industrialized species might have long predated human existence on Earth, but vanished without leaving a discernible paleontological trace. Paleontological trace, right? Or at least ones that have been discovered by humans, right? This is the idea that, hey, is it possible that there could have been an advanced civilization like ours, or even more advanced, that was wiped out by one of these catastrophes or just the changes in the Earth, and all physical evidence of it is totally gone? It's possible, right? We can't rule it out. They mentioned the Silurian hypothesis, right? That this idea that reptiles back, because we know that, or apparently we know that the Earth was populated by giant reptiles. And so there's this hypothesis that perhaps a group of them went underground during the catastrophic event that allegedly wiped out the dinosaurs about 60 million years ago. And what if they went underground, survived, and developed, and then they became this sort of humanoid, sort of bipedal creature, intelligent creature, and perhaps that could explain, this alleged existence of these reptilian aliens on Earth. And even Avi Loeb from Harvard, who you've probably heard of if you've been following the UAP subject, a quote here I never heard him say, where he says, planets like Mars or Earth could have given multiple births to technological civilizations that were 1 billion years apart and were not aware of each other. So the possibility of that being possible is, it's been stated here by Harvard professors, And so, in coffee talk, table talk, people will probably roll their eyes and go, oh, that sounds ridiculous that there could be advanced civilizations millions of years ago. But hey, look, respect to these authors of putting this out there and saying, hey, look, let's start to seriously consider this and maybe start to investigate it more empirically. So, and again, quoting that, again from Bernardo Kastrup, that, quote, there's been plenty of time and opportunity for other non-human species to have arisen on Earth, developed a level of technology far beyond ours, and then to have effectively vanished due to one or more of the myriad possible civilization-ending cataclysms. All right, and then we get into looking outside of Earth and looking on Mars, and they go into some of the anomalies that have been found on Mars. All right, and pardon me for a minute, I'm trying to write this down. Yeah, like I said here, look, we're at 48 minutes here, so this is going to be one of those longer videos, and one of just those deep dives. And we're not even going to get through the whole paper. We're actually only halfway through the paper, so we're going to have to do part 1 and part 2 on this. So let's see here. Let's just scan ahead a bit. They talk about Mars. They talk about lost civilizations. So this is actually probably a good place to bookmark it, I'm going to say. And because next time we'll start with the artifacts from Mars, or the anomalies on Mars, and then we go into the other anomalies that then get into, like, could there be these lost civilizations? Could there be underground civilizations? So yeah, here in part 1 we kind of just get into the paper and what they're starting to present. And I'm sorry for the screen scrolling there. When I've watched these backs, when I've watched these screen share videos back, I kind of see how that's like a little bit nauseating. So I'm going to try to be more mindful of that. All right, so that's where we're going to bookmark it today. And thank you for watching with us here today at Xpanded Knowledge. And we'll get into the rest of this in the next video. The anomalies on Mars are very interesting and something that I've particularly found to be very compelling in what happened in the 70s and some of the stuff that Richard Hoagland reported on. So, yeah, please let me know what you think about anything that was touched on in this video here today. I definitely am curious to hear your thoughts, and if you enjoyed the information here, if it, any bit of it helps you go on to your own exploration of just a massive amount of information that's out there, appreciate you hit the like button and subscribe and all that stuff. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.